Hi, I'm Murphy Griffin.
And I'm Madison Taylor.
And welcome to episode 13 of Neophyte Boatwrights. In this episode, we're going to show you how we installed the stem and the stern post onto our keel. So,
let's get to it.
So with the stem and stern post now shaped, we need to plan out exactly how we're going to bolt everything together. Now, fortunate for us, all of the bolt layout information has been provided in the construction plan. So here you see the stern post and stern knee, and provided for us is exactly how the bolts should be laid out, both their position and the angle. So what we're going to have to do is figure out the coordinates for where these bolts need to be placed, and then transfer all of that information to the stern assembly. We have similar information for the stem and the stem knee. For both the stern assembly and the stem assembly, there are 4 bolts. 2 bolts holding the knee to the stern post or stem, and then 2 bolts holding the whole assembly to the keel. We will have to bore for all the bolts as well as countersink on both sides for the bolt heads as well as the washers and nuts. We'll be doing all of the boring with auger bits, 5/16 auger bits for the bolts and 7/8 auger bit for the countersinking. So from the construction plan, we determined the coordinates for all the bolts. We then plotted this information onto the lofting board. It was then simply a case of transferring this information from the lofting board to the physical stem and stern post. And so with the bolt alignment information transferred to the stem and stern post, it was time to get boring. Okay, so we're gearing up to bore the holes for the stem assembly. What you see is the stem knee and the stem are clamped together, and we've drawn in the bolt alignment lines between the 2 pieces. So what we've done is we've clamped a straight edge on the other side whose edge is in line with our alignment line. Madison is going to keep his eye on the auger bit and make sure that it stays aligned with this edge here.
Up a tiny bit, down a tiny bit, kind of split.
Meanwhile, I'll make sure that I don't sway left or right, so that ideally, when we start our boring in the middle here, we'll come out the other side in the middle. Okay, so we've bored our very first hole in the stem assembly, and it came out pretty well. We remained decently centered and came out just a little north of where we wanted to, but that's fine, it's gonna work great. So the next thing we need to do is drill another hole for the next bolt. In order to make sure that everything stays put and doesn't shift around on us, we've got the clamps, but we're also going to use one of our bolts, our silicon bronze bolts, as a drift pin. So we're just gonna push that all the way through, and that will keep things from shifting around on us. With the first 2 holes bored in the stem assembly, we can now turn our attention to the stern post and stern knee. We follow precisely the same procedure, aligning a straight edge with the bolt alignment lines and then guiding the auger bit in line with the straight edge. Once the first 2 holes are bored, we'll be able to bolt the stern and stem assemblies together so we can continue to work on them. So we've bored the holes in the stern post, and now we need to countersink them so that the heads of the carriage bolts will sit flush with the surface. In order to make this easy on ourselves, we've prepared a little piece of dowel, 5/16 dowel, that we're going to drive into the hole so that the spur of the auger bit will have something to bite into. With the dowel filling the hole, we can then center the auger bit and try to follow the previous bolt alignment line to get the angle right. Once the countersinking is done, we can simply just drive a bolt through the hole to get the dowel out. This is then repeated for the second boring. In terms of the depth that you need to countersink for the carriage bolts, you really don't need to go that deep. We probably have gone about 1/4 of an inch at most in depth, and we've definitely gone deep enough to bury the head of the carriage bolt. Once the square part of the bolt buries into the wood, the head of the bolt will definitely be below the surface of the stern post here. So in addition to countersinking for the carriage bolt heads, we also need to countersink for the other side of the bolt where the washer and the nut are going to sit. So we've got a nut and a washer loaded up on one of our bolts, and you can see that as we tighten down the nut, that it won't sit flush with the washer. So we need to partially countersink this side on the knee so that the washer can sit square with the bolt. And that way the nut itself will tighten flush against the washer. We then start the countersinking just as before, filling the hole with a small piece of dowel so that the spur of the auger bit can bite into something. We then follow the angle of the bolt alignment line that's already there. Okay, so now you can see that we've bored out just enough of a countersink so that the washer is sitting flat, and when we tighten down the nut, it's sitting flush with the washer. Rinse and repeat. Having countersunk for the first 2 bolts in both the stem and stern assemblies, we can now look at bolting them both to the keel. So we have the whole stern assembly bolted together at this point, and we've now clamped it to the keel, and we've made sure to align the center line of the stern post and stern knee with the center line that we have drawn on the keel. So we have 2 points of reference there. So we have the center line on the stern knee here, and you can see that we have it aligned with the center line on the keel. So that's 1 point of reference for alignment. And the second alignment we have is in the back off of the stern post and the keel, where we've aligned the 2 center lines there as well. Our next objective now is to bore the holes to bolt the stern assembly down to the keel. We've drawn in lines to help us align our bolt positions, and we've attached a straight edge so that we can use that to reference with our auger bit and make sure that we're coming in at the right angle. So the important thing to notice here is we're not just boring through the stern knee, but also through the keel. This will enable us to bolt the whole stern assembly down to the keel. bored the bolt holes that are going to hold the stern assembly to the keel, and now we've flipped the keel over so that we can countersink the bolt holes. Since we bored the bolt holes at an angle, we need to also countersink for the bolt heads at the same angle. We're going to put a bolt through the hole and use it as a reference. In order to figure out the angle of the bolt, we're going to use a bevel gauge. All we have to do is line the bevel gauge up with the bolt and make sure everything's flush, and we can tighten it down. So this effectively copies the angle that the bolt is at. So now we can use this bevel gauge to help us align the auger bit to countersink for the bolt head. The same procedure is followed again for the second bolt hole. Picking up the angle of the boring by using the bolt as a reference, driving in a small piece of dowel for the auger bit to bite into, and countersinking with a 7/8 auger bit. We then again have to countersink the other side of the stern knee so that the washer and nut sit flush. Okay, so with all the bolt holes countersunk, we're ready to dry fit the stern post. We now could turn our attention to the stem assembly. We made a slight tweak to the foot of the stem so it could sit nice and flush, and then ran it through the drum sander so that the differences in thickness between the stem and the stem knee were ironed out. From there, we could follow the same exact procedure as we did with the stern assembly. We lined up the stem with the center line on the keel, and then bored the two holes that will attach the stem assembly to the keel, countersinking where needed. Having both the stem and stern assemblies dry fit to the keel, we can now trim off the little bits of excess keel. Okay, so with the stern post and the stem now mounted on the keel, we need to cut off the excess portions of the keel that overhang past the stern post and the stem. In the case of the stern post, we just need to cut an angle that flows in line with the rake of the stern post. Okay, so what we're going to do is take a bevel gauge and set it back here against the keel and against the stern post. And once we have the right angle, we can use that to transfer the angle onto the keel. So just like with the stern post, now we need to lop off the front of the keel to make it flow into the stem. Unlike the stern post, the cutaway isn't a straight line, it's actually a curve. So we need to fair that in with the shape of the stem. So we've got a batten clamped up here, and we're going to bend it around the stem so we know that we're flowing into the stem. And we've marked on the keel where we want the line to terminate. So with that mark, we can bring the batten in alignment with it and mark the curve. And so as you can see, this is not a straight line. This is a slight arc. Okay, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna take the stem and the knee apart. And on the face of the faying surface here, we're going to come back in with a gouge and cut a little channel on this face. This channel will take in polysulfide bedding compound and will act as a sort of gasket between the knee and the stem. Okay, so we've marked a little guideline here on this faying surface for the channel that we're about to vein out. We're gonna use this little scoop gouge, this veiner here, to cut this out, and we'll just do it by hand. Nothing needs to be perfect here. So here you see the channel that we cut out with the veiner. And again, what we're gonna do is when we go to bed down the knee on the stem, we'll fill this channel with polysulfide bedding compound. And that way, when we tighten everything down, even if all the other bedding compound squeezes out, there will be a nice bead of bedding compound left to create a good watertight seal. With the faying surface loaded up with bedding compound, we can finally bolt down the knee to the stem. At this point, the knee and the stem effectively become one. We now follow the same procedure for the stern post and stern knee, carving out a small channel that we will then fill with bedding compound, and then finally bolting the knee down to the stern post. It's finally time to bed the stem and stern assemblies down to the keel. We started with the stern assembly. We bolted up temporarily the stern assembly onto the keel so that we could trace the outline of its foot. We then came back and veined out a small channel on this surface that again we will fill with bedding compound. The idea with the channel of bedding compound is that we're forming a watertight gasket that will keep water from getting trapped in the interior of the stern knee. This area would be far more likely to develop some sort of wood rot or mold. And then we finally turned to the stem assembly, following the exact same process. We temporarily mounted up the stem assembly, traced the foot of it out onto the keel, carved a small channel that we then filled with bedding compound, and then bolted down the stem assembly to the keel. And so with a few last turns of a wrench, the stem and stern posts were finally mounted. So that's episode 13. We really hope you enjoyed it. Stay tuned next time. We'll be going over everything we had to do to make and install the transom onto our boat.
So if you guys are enjoying the series, don't forget to like and subscribe below, and also consider becoming a patron on our Patreon page. The expenses are really starting to add up. We're about to have to plank the boat, which is going to be one of the most expensive things we've done, and we can only do that with your support.
And on that note, we have 4 new patrons. Much thanks to Ben de Laurent and Sean Sheriff.
And Ted and Catherine Stedman.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.